Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. The emergency klaxons of Space Station Nexus Prime hadn't stopped wailing for 3 hours, and frankly, everyone was getting a headache. Not the kind of headache you get from too much synthetic wine at a diplomatic reception, mind you, but the sort that comes from realizing your entire species might be about to get wiped off the galactic map because of what could charitably be called a communication error. Ambassador Ethan Rivers stood outside the sealed blast doors of Council Chamber 1, straightening his formal diplomatic jacket, and wondering, not for the first time in his career, how exactly he'd ended up being humanity's go-to guy for impossible situations involving angry aliens. His reflection in the polished metal doors showed a man in his early 40s, graying at the temples in a way that his ex-wife used to call distinguished, and he preferred to think of as earned through sheer survival instinct. Inside the chamber, voices were rising to levels that would have been considered impolite in most civilized societies, which was saying something, considering that 3 of the speakers weren't even technically capable of rudeness by human standards. They were just naturally terrifying. The bio readings are conclusive. The voice belonged to War Commander Prowlach of the Felinar Empire, and it carried the kind of authority that came from having personally conquered 6-star systems before breakfast. These humans register as the highest threat level our scanners have ever recorded. Chancellor Gorveth, whose reptilian ancestors had probably eaten things twice the size of humans as appetizers, made a sound like gravel being processed through a cement mixer. In Saurid culture, this passed for thoughtful consideration. Perhaps we should examine the data more carefully before making any permanent decisions. Permanent decisions. That was diplomatic speak for complete annihilation, and Ethan knew it. He'd been in this business long enough to recognize euphemisms when they were being politely discussed in 17 different languages simultaneously. Minister Pellix chimed in, literally chimed, since Quartzians communicated through harmonic resonance that sounded like wind chimes having an argument. Her crystalline form caught the chamber's lights and threw rainbow patterns across the walls as she vibrated with what Ethan's universal translator helpfully labeled as extreme concern mixed with barely contained panic. The readings show aggression levels that exceed even the void wraiths of the Epsilon sector, she sang in frequencies that made nearby water glasses shatter. How do we know they haven't already begun some form of psychological warfare? Director Nix floated near the chamber's ceiling, their ethereal form shifting between visible and translucent in a way that suggested either deep meditation or a migraine of cosmic proportions. Voidlings didn't technically have heads, but if they did, Nix would definitely be holding theirs right now. The scans are unprecedented, Nix whispered, their voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen the birth and death of stars and was still somehow surprised by the universe's capacity for throwing curveballs. In 800 cycles of council membership, we have never encountered readings like these. Ethan pressed his palm against the door's access panel, which immediately began flashing red and emitting a sound like a smoke detector having a nervous breakdown. Every security system on the station had been doing that since he'd arrived 6 hours ago, which was really starting to wear on his nerves. Ambassador Rivers, came the station's AI voice, sounding about as enthusiastic as a funeral director. Your biological signature continues to register as a Class Omega threat. Are you certain you wish to enter the chamber? Oh, absolutely, Ethan muttered under his breath. Nothing I love more than walking into a room full of people who think I'm the galactic equivalent of a walking nuclear weapon. The blast doors slid open with a hiss that sounded distinctly disapproving, and Ethan stepped into what could generously be described as controlled chaos, and more accurately be called barely contained hysteria. The council chamber was a masterpiece of diplomatic architecture, designed to make every species feel equally important and equally intimidated. The circular room rose in tiers, with each delegation's seating area carefully calibrated for their specific atmospheric and gravitational needs. Under normal circumstances, it was quite beautiful. Under current circumstances, it looked like the setting for either a very important trial or a very elaborate execution. War Commander Prowlock dominated the Felinar section, his massive form radiating the kind of predatory grace that had made his species the most feared warriors in 3 galactic quadrants. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, with midnight black fur marked by silver stripes, and eyes that glowed like molten gold, he looked exactly like what would happen if you took a panther, made it the size of a grizzly bear, gave it opposable thumbs, and then trained it in 17 different forms of combat. Behind him, arranged in a protective formation that spoke volumes about current tensions, stood a dozen other Felinar warriors. But what caught Ethan's attention, and what made his diplomatic instincts start tingling, were the smaller figures partially hidden behind the adults. Cubs. They'd brought cubs to what was supposed to be a cultural exchange. Ambassador Rivers, Chancellor Gorvith rumbled, his forked tongue flicking out to taste the air, in a gesture that Ethan had learned to interpret as either curiosity or preparation for violence. Sometimes, both. Your arrival has been eagerly anticipated. Every scanner in the room immediately began shrieking like banshees with stage fright. The sound was so overwhelming that several of the younger Felinar cubs pressed closer to their guardians, their ears flattened against their skulls in obvious distress. "Well," Ethan said, raising his voice over the cacophony, "I do try to make an impression." War Commander Prowlock's golden eyes fixed on him with the intensity of a targeting system. "Your species has been classified as a galactic threat based on irrefutable biological evidence. Our most advanced scanners indicate levels of danger that exceed our measurement capabilities." "That's interesting," Ethan replied, genuinely puzzled, "because from where I'm standing, I'm just a middle-aged diplomat who had airline food for lunch and is wondering if anyone's thought to check whether your scanners might need recalibrating." The suggestion that Felinar technology might be flawed was apparently equivalent to questioning their mother's honor and their god's competence simultaneously. Prowlock's fur bristled, making him appear even larger, and a low growl began building in his chest that seemed to resonate through the station's hull. "Our scanners," he said, with the kind of deadly quiet that preceded either profound wisdom or spectacular violence, "have never failed us. They read biological aggression, predatory instinct, and threat potential with perfect accuracy. And you, human, register as the most dangerous creature we have ever encountered." Minister Pellax's harmonic chiming reached frequencies that made Ethan's teeth ache. The readings suggest psychological manipulation capabilities beyond anything in our databases. How do we know you're not influencing our thoughts even now? "Because if I had mind control powers," Ethan said reasonably, "don't you think I would have used them to get a better parking spot at the spaceport?" Director Nix drifted lower, their ethereal form solidifying slightly as they focused their attention on him. "The readings are consistent across all our scanning technologies. Whatever your species has evolved into, it represents a fundamental threat to galactic stability." And there it was. The real issue wasn't just about humanity's potential for violence. It was about fear of the unknown. These species had spent millennia perfecting their understanding of biological threats, and humans had apparently broken their entire system of classification. "Look," Ethan began, spreading his hands in what he hoped was a universally recognized gesture of peaceful intent. "I understand this is concerning, but maybe we could start with some basic questions, like, what exactly are your scanners detecting?" War Commander Prowlak exchanged glances with his warriors, a silent communication that spoke of shared experiences and mutual trust. When he turned back to Ethan, his expression had shifted from immediate hostility to something that might have been professional wariness. Aggression indicators beyond measurement, predatory focus that exceeds apex hunters, and most disturbing. He paused, his golden eyes narrowing. Emotional manipulation capabilities that suggest your species could dominate others through psychological means rather than physical force. Ethan blinked, then blinked again, then had to resist the urge to laugh, because laughing at a 3-meter-tall alien warrior who thought you were a cosmic threat seemed like the kind of career decision that would feature prominently in his obituary. "Emotional manipulation," he repeated slowly. "Your scanners think humans are emotionally manipulative?" The readings indicate an unprecedented capacity for forming psychological bonds with other species, Chancellor Gorveth added, his reptilian features managing to convey something that might have been academic interest mixed with existential dread. "This suggests a form of conquest through emotional dependency rather than military force." And suddenly, despite the gravity of the situation and the very real possibility that this misunderstanding might lead to humanity's extinction, Ethan found himself fighting back a smile, because he was beginning to understand exactly what had gone wrong. The problem with being a diplomat, Ethan reflected, as he watched a room full of the galaxy's most powerful beings debate whether his species should be quarantined or eliminated, was that you developed a tendency to see the humor in situations that were objectively terrifying. Right now, for instance, he was trying very hard not to laugh at the fact that humanity's greatest threat to galactic peace appeared to be their capacity for giving good hugs. War Commander Prowlak had moved to the chamber's central display unit, his massive claws dancing over holographic controls with surprising delicacy. The air shimmered, and suddenly the room was filled with 3-dimensional bio-readings that looked like abstract art designed by someone having a particularly vivid nightmare. "Observe," Prowlak rumbled, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Standard Felinar bioscan of a human subject taken during initial contact protocols." The hologram showed a humanoid figure surrounded by swirling clouds of red and orange energy, pulsing with rhythms that seemed almost hypnotic. To Ethan, it looked like a lava lamp having an identity crisis. To everyone else in the room, it apparently looked like the galactic equivalent of a nuclear weapon with social anxiety. "The red indicators show aggression potential," Prowlak continued, pointing to areas where the energy patterns seemed most intense. "Orange represents predatory focus. The pulsing patterns suggest active, psychological manipulation attempts." Minister Pellax chimed in with harmonics that sounded like crystal glasses being tortured. "Our own scans confirm similar readings. The psychological emanations are unlike anything in our databases." "Because," Director Nix added, their ethereal form flickering with what Ethan was learning to recognize as voidling agitation, "most species project emotional energy inward, toward their own kind. Humans appear to project it outward, toward any sentient being in their vicinity." Ethan studied the hologram, trying to see it from their perspective. The swirling patterns did look rather ominous, if you didn't know what you were looking at. Unfortunately, explaining human empathy to species that had evolved completely different emotional frameworks was like trying to describe color to someone who'd been blind since birth. "What you're seeing," he began carefully, "might not be what you think you're seeing." Prolak's golden eyes fixed on him with laser intensity. "Are you suggesting our equipment is malfunctioning?" "I'm suggesting," Ethan said, choosing his words with the precision of a surgeon, "that your equipment might be measuring something it wasn't designed to measure." The chamber erupted in what could charitably be called spirited discussion, and more accurately be described as barely controlled pandemonium. Chancellor Gorveth's reptilian hiss competed with Minister Pelax's crystalline shrieking, while Director Nix's ethereal form began cycling through colors that probably meant something profound in voidling culture, but looked like a disco ball having an existential crisis. Through it all, Ethan noticed something that made his diplomatic instincts start tingling like a spider sense, designed specifically for cultural misunderstandings. The Felinar cubs were watching him, not with the wary hostility of their elders, but with the kind of curious attention that young beings everywhere seem to reserve for interesting new things. One cub in particular, smaller than the others, with fur that shifted from deep brown to golden highlights depending on the light, had actually taken a few steps closer to the chamber's central area. "The scans don't lie," War Commander Prowlak was saying, his voice cutting through the general chaos like a blade through silk. "Every piece of technology we possess confirms the same readings. Humans represent an unprecedented threat to galactic stability." "But what kind of threat?" Ethan asked, genuinely curious now. "I mean, specifically. What do your threat assessment protocols suggest we're actually going to do?" Prolak exchanged glances with his warriors, and Ethan caught something in their expressions that he hadn't expected. Uncertainty. These were beings who'd built an empire on their ability to assess and eliminate threats, and they were encountering something that didn't fit their established categories. "The readings suggest," Prolak said slowly, "that humans possess the ability to form emotional bonds with other species so profound that they could potentially influence behavior through psychological dependency." "Conquest through affection," Chancellor Gorveth added, his forked tongue flicking nervously. "Domination through emotional manipulation." "A form of warfare we've never encountered," Minister Pelax chimed, her crystalline form throwing nervous rainbows across the walls. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the chamber's doors sliding open with another disapproving hiss. The new arrival was Dr. Meridian Frost, the station's chief xenobiologist, and she looked like someone who'd been running through corridors while simultaneously trying to analyze impossible data and maintain some semblance of scientific objectivity. Dr. Frost was the kind of person who made organized chaos look like a lifestyle choice. Her dark hair was escaping from what had probably started the day as a professional bun. Her lab coat showed evidence of at least 3 different chemical spills, and she was carrying a portable scanner that was beeping, flashing, and generally having what appeared to be a mechanical nervous breakdown. "Sorry I'm late," she said, slightly out of breath, "but I've been running every test I can think of, and the results are—" She paused, looking around the chamber at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. "Well, they're interesting." War Commander Prowlak's attention focused on her with the intensity of a targeting laser. "Dr. Frost, your analysis?" "The bio readings are accurate," she said, consulting her scanner with the expression of someone who'd been staring at impossible data for hours. "Humans do emit the energy patterns your equipment is detecting, but I think there might be a fundamental misunderstanding about what those patterns actually mean." "Elaborate," Director Nix whispered, their ethereal form solidifying with what Ethan recognized as intense concentration. Dr. Frost activated her own holographic display, and suddenly the chamber was filled with comparative bioscans from dozens of different species. Every sentient race emits some form of emotional energy. It's part of how we interact with our environment and each other. But most species, she gestured to the various displays, where energy patterns remained tightly contained around each figure. Most species keep their emotional emanations focused inward, toward members of their own kind. She switched to the human bioscan, and the difference was immediately obvious. Where other species showed contained, inward-focused energy patterns, humans showed something that looked like emotional fireworks exploding in all directions. Humans, Dr. Frost continued, appear to have evolved an unusual trait. Their emotional energy doesn't discriminate based on species. They project empathy, curiosity, and bonding impulses toward any sentient being they encounter, which our scanners interpret as aggression, Prowlax said slowly, his golden eyes narrowing as understanding began to dawn. Because your scanners were designed to detect emotional predators, Dr. Frost confirmed. Beings who use emotional manipulation to control or harm others. But what if you encountered a species that had evolved the exact opposite trait? What if you found beings who instinctively try to form emotional connections with everyone they meet? The chamber fell silent, except for the continued shrieking of various scanning devices, all of which seemed to be having collective nervous breakdowns in Ethan's presence. It was during this moment of profound quiet that the small Felinar cub, the one with the brown and golden fur, finally succumbed to curiosity and took another step forward, and another, until suddenly there was a young Felinar standing less than 2 meters away from Ethan, staring up at him with eyes that held the kind of fearless curiosity that seemed to be universal among children, regardless of species. The adult Felinar immediately went into what could politely be called protective mode, and more accurately be described as barely controlled panic. Warriors who'd faced down space pirates and conquered star systems were suddenly faced with something far more terrifying than any enemy: a child who wasn't following safety protocols. Whisktail! War Commander Prowlax's voice carried a note of parental authority that transcended species barriers. Return to the group immediately. But Whisktail, like children everywhere when faced with something infinitely more interesting than adult instructions, completely ignored the command. Instead, the young cub tilted their head, a gesture that was somehow both utterly alien and completely familiar, and made a soft sound that Ethan's universal translator couldn't quite process. Whisktail, Prowlax repeated, his voice now carrying undertones that suggested this particular cub had a history of independent thinking that gave their guardians premature gray fur. The other adult Felinar were moving now, forming a protective circle that would allow them to retrieve their wayward young one without exposing themselves to whatever terrible influence the human might exert. Their movements were fluid, professional, and spoke of countless hours of training in child retrieval protocols. But as they moved, something unexpected happened. Whisktail, apparently startled by all the sudden adult attention and movement, did what young beings everywhere do when overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. They panicked. The young cub darted sideways, away from the advancing adults, and managed to wedge themselves behind a section of the chamber's environmental control housing. Within seconds, soft sounds of distress were emanating from the hiding spot. Sounds that needed no translation to convey fear, confusion, and the universal desire for someone to make everything okay again. And that was when Ethan's diplomatic training, His years of experience in cross-cultural communication and his carefully cultivated professional objectivity ran headlong into something far more fundamental than politics or protocol. His instincts as someone who simply couldn't stand to see a frightened child. What happened next would later be debated in diplomatic circles, analyzed by xenobiologists, and probably feature in at least 3 different species' cautionary tales about the unpredictable nature of humans. But in the moment, Ethan wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about a scared kid who needed help, and everything else, including the very real possibility that his next action might trigger an interstellar incident, became secondary considerations. "Everyone, stop moving," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that came from years of diffusing tense situations. "You're scaring them." War Commander Prowlack's response was immediate and predictable. "You will not approach the cub. Our readings indicate—" "Your readings," Ethan interrupted, "indicate that I'm emotionally dangerous, which, if Dr. Frost is right, means I'm exactly what that kid needs right now." He took a step toward the environmental housing, where soft whimpering sounds continued to emerge. Every scanner in the room immediately escalated from concerned beeping to full-scale electronic hysteria, creating a cacophony that would have been impressive if it weren't so utterly counterproductive. "Ambassador!" Chancellor Gorvith rumbled, his reptilian form tensing in preparation for something, probably violence. "This is inadvisable." "Most of the best diplomatic decisions are," Ethan replied, taking another step. The whimpering from behind the housing grew more distressed, and he could see golden eyes reflecting the chamber's lights from the shadows. "Dr. Frost, would you mind explaining to everyone what's actually happening here?" Dr. Frost consulted her scanner, which was now producing readings that looked like abstract art designed by someone having a fever dream. "The human's emotional output is extraordinary, but it's not aggressive. It's—" She paused, staring at the data with the expression of someone who'd discovered something that challenged fundamental assumptions. "It's protective, nurturing. The energy patterns are consistent with what we'd expect from a parent approaching a distressed offspring." "Impossible," Minister Pellex chimed, her crystalline form vibrating with frequencies that suggested deep skepticism. "Interspecies parental responses don't exist. The biological mechanisms—" "The biological mechanisms," Dr. Frost interrupted, "apparently don't apply to humans the way we thought they did." Ethan knelt down about a meter away from the hiding spot, moving slowly and deliberately. The whimpering stopped, replaced by the kind of cautious silence that suggested someone was paying very close attention to what happened next. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice carrying the universal tone that adults everywhere seemed to instinctively use with frightened children. "That's a pretty good hiding spot you found." A small sound emerged from the shadows. Not quite a whimper, not quite a chirp, but something that conveyed curiosity mixed with wariness. "I know all the adults are being really loud and scary right now," Ethan continued, settling into a more comfortable position. "Sometimes adults forget that their voices can be frightening when they're worried about something." War Commander Prowlack was making sounds that suggested he was experiencing some form of internal conflict between his protective instincts and his professional assessment of threat levels. His warriors were arranged in a formation that would allow them to intervene immediately if the human showed any signs of hostile intent, but their body language suggested they were as confused as everyone else about what they were actually witnessing. "The readings are—" Director Nix whispered, their ethereal form flickering with what Ethan was learning to recognize as voidling amazement. "The human's biosignature is adapting. modulating to match what the cub needs to feel safe. "That's not possible," Prowlock growled, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "Ambassador," Dr. Frost said, her scanner now producing a steady stream of data that seemed to fascinate and terrify her in equal measure. "Your emotional output is synchronizing with the cub's distress patterns. It's like you're instinctively trying to provide exactly the kind of comfort they need." A small golden snout appeared at the edge of the hiding spot, followed by one cautious eye. Whisktail was watching Ethan with the kind of intense focus that suggested they were trying to figure out whether this strange alien creature was friend or foe. "That's right," Ethan said encouragingly. "I'm not going anywhere, just going to sit here until you decide what you want to do." "This is unprecedented," Chancellor Gorvith rumbled, his forked tongue flicking nervously. "Interspecies emotional bonding at this level. It challenges everything we understand about biological boundaries." "Maybe," Ethan said, not taking his eyes off the small face watching him from the shadows. "That's because you've been thinking about it wrong. Maybe emotional connection isn't about biology. Maybe it's about something else entirely." Whisktail took a tentative step out of their hiding spot, then another. The young Felinar moved with the fluid grace that seemed to be inherent to their species, but there was still uncertainty in their posture, still wariness in their golden eyes. "Easy," Ethan murmured, extending one hand palm up in what he hoped was a universally non-threatening gesture. "Nobody's going to hurt you. I promise." "The human is making promises to a being whose language he doesn't speak," Minister Pelax observed, her harmonic chiming now carrying notes of what might have been wonder. "And somehow, the cub appears to understand." Dr. Frost was frantically taking readings, her scanner producing data streams that would probably keep xenobiologists busy for decades. "The emotional synchronization is complete. The human's biosignature has essentially created a localized field of calm and safety. It's like he's broadcasting parental reassurance on frequencies that transcend species barriers." Whisktail had emerged completely from their hiding spot now, standing about half a meter away from Ethan and studying him with the kind of intense curiosity that seemed universal among young beings everywhere. The cub's fur was fluffed with residual anxiety, but their posture had shifted from terrified to cautiously interested. "That's a beautiful coat you have," Ethan said conversationally, as if he were chatting with a neighbor's child, rather than potentially triggering the first interspecies diplomatic crisis based on improper petting protocols. "Those golden highlights are really something special." Whisktail made a sound that Ethan's translator still couldn't process, but the tone was unmistakably pleased. The young Felinar took another step closer, now within arm's reach if Ethan had been inclined to move suddenly, which he absolutely wasn't, because he could feel the weight of every adult gaze in the chamber focused on him with laser intensity. "The cub is displaying trust behaviors," War Commander Prolak said, his voice carrying a note of amazement that he was clearly trying to suppress. "Complete trust behaviors. This should not be possible with an unknown species." "Unless," Dr. Frost said slowly, consulting her readings with the expression of someone who was watching their entire understanding of xenobiology get rewritten in real time. "The human isn't unknown to the cub's instincts. Unless humans somehow trigger recognition patterns that transcend species boundaries." Whisktail was now close enough that Ethan could see the individual whiskers twitching with curiosity, could observe the way their ears swiveled to track sounds around the chamber while keeping primary attention focused on him. The young Felinar was beautiful in the way that all young creatures were beautiful, full of potential and curiosity, and the kind of fearless openness that adults spent years learning to suppress. "May I?" Ethan asked, moving his hand very slowly toward the space just behind Whisktail's ear. "Just a gentle scratch? It won't hurt, I promise." Whisktail tilted their head, considering the question with the seriousness that children everywhere brought to important decisions. After a moment that felt like an eternity, the young cub stepped forward and bumped their head against Ethan's palm. And that was when everything changed. Ethan's fingers found the soft spot behind Whisktail's ear and began a gentle scratching motion, the kind of instinctive gesture that humans had been using to comfort animals for millennia. It was such a simple action, so automatic and natural, that he almost didn't notice the immediate response. The purring started as a barely audible vibration, a sound so soft that it might have been mistaken for the station's environmental systems. But within seconds, it grew stronger, deeper, more resonant, until the entire chamber was filled with a sound that needed no translation. Pure contentment, absolute trust, the kind of happiness that existed beyond language or species barriers. Every adult Felinar in the chamber froze, as if they'd been struck by lightning. "Impossible," War Commander Prowlack whispered, his golden eyes wide with shock. "Whisktail. Whisktail is purring." "Is that bad?" Ethan asked, continuing the gentle scratching motion, because Whisktail was now leaning into his touch, with the complete abandon of a being who had decided that this was exactly what they needed. "Purring," Prowlack said, his voice carrying a reverence that transformed his entire demeanor, "is the highest expression of trust and contentment in Felinar culture. Cubs only purr for their parents, their littermates, and—" He paused, staring at the scene before him with something approaching awe. "And for beings they consider to be family." Dr. Frost's scanner was now producing readings that looked like fireworks exploding in slow motion. The emotional resonance is off the charts. The human and the cub have achieved complete harmonic synchronization. It's like they're operating on the same emotional frequency. "This changes everything," Director Nix whispered, their ethereal form solidifying completely for the first time since Ethan had entered the chamber. "If humans can achieve this level of emotional connection with other species, then our threat assessment protocols," Chancellor Gorveth rumbled, his reptilian features managing to convey something that might have been wonder, "have been measuring the wrong kind of danger entirely." Whisktail had now settled completely against Ethan's side, their purring creating vibrations that seemed to resonate through the chamber's hull. Other young Felinar were beginning to emerge from behind their guardians, drawn by the sound of contentment and the promise of whatever magic the strange alien was working. "The scans were right," War Commander Prowlack said slowly, his entire worldview clearly undergoing rapid reconstruction. "Humans are dangerous. They're dangerous because they can make us feel safe." And suddenly, Ethan understood exactly what had happened. Why every scanner in known space had been screaming warnings about his species, and why the greatest diplomatic crisis in galactic history had been triggered by humanity's most fundamental characteristic. They weren't reading humans as threats because humans were aggressive. They were reading humans as threats because humans were the exact opposite of aggressive, and that was something the galaxy had never encountered before. The sound of purring had apparently triggered some kind of biological imperative in every young Felinar within hearing range, because within minutes Ethan found himself surrounded by a collection of cubs who seemed to have collectively decided that the strange alien was the most interesting thing they'd encountered since discovering that their own tails were attached to their bodies. War Commander Prowlack watched this development with the expression of someone whose fundamental understanding of the universe was being systematically dismantled and rebuilt in real time. His warriors, beings who had conquered star systems and faced down cosmic horrors without flinching, were now dealing with something far more challenging than any enemy they'd ever encountered: the sight of their young displaying complete trust toward an alien species. "This is," Prowlock began, then stopped, apparently lacking words in any language to describe what he was witnessing. "Revolutionary," Dr. Frost supplied, her scanner now producing data streams that looked like abstract poetry written in mathematics. "Ambassador, your bio readings are adapting to each individual cub. It's like you're instinctively providing exactly the kind of emotional support each one needs." Whisktail had claimed the prime position directly against Ethan's side, their purring now joined by a chorus of smaller voices as other cubs discovered the joy of human ear-scratching techniques. One particularly bold youngster with silver-striped fur had draped themselves across Ethan's lap, while another was investigating his jacket buttons with the kind of intense scientific curiosity that would have made xenobiologists proud. "The emotional resonance patterns," Director Nix observed, their ethereal form flickering with what Ethan was learning to recognize as voidling fascination, "suggest that humans have evolved a form of universal empathy. Not just the ability to understand other species' emotions, but to actively provide what those emotions need for balance and comfort." Minister Pellix's crystalline chiming had shifted to frequencies that sounded almost musical. "Our databases contain no records of any species capable of such broad-spectrum emotional compatibility. Most beings can barely achieve this level of connection with their own kind." Chancellor Gorvith's reptilian features were arranged in what might have been contemplation, or might have been the early stages of an existential crisis. If humans can form these bonds with any species they encounter, then they represent the most powerful force for unity the galaxy has ever seen. War Commander Prowlock finished, his voice carrying a note of wonder that transformed his entire presence from intimidating warrior to amazed observer. "Or the most dangerous weapon, depending on how they choose to use this ability." "That's just it, though," Ethan said, gently extracting his sleeve from the curious investigation of a particularly determined cub. "We don't choose to use it. It's not a weapon or a tool or a diplomatic strategy. It's just who we are." He looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization, all of whom were staring at him with expressions ranging from amazement to terror to something that might have been hope. "Humans bond," he continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was finally understanding something fundamental about his own species. "We bond with our families, our friends, our pets, our communities. We form emotional connections with fictional characters and historical figures and abstract concepts. We anthropomorphize everything from weather patterns to household appliances. We can't help it. It's hardwired into our psychology so deeply that we don't even think about it." Dr. Frost was nodding enthusiastically, her scanner forgotten as the implications of what she was witnessing began to sink in. The evolutionary advantage would have been enormous. A species that could form emotional bonds with any other species would have unprecedented survival capabilities. They could ally with anyone, communicate with anyone, find common ground with anyone, or manipulate anyone, War Commander Prowlock pointed out, though his tone lacked its earlier hostility. "The potential for abuse of such abilities is exactly why your scanners flagged us as dangerous," Ethan agreed. "Because in the wrong hands, the ability to form instant emotional connections could be the ultimate weapon. But here's the thing about humans." He paused, looking down at the collection of young Felinar who had turned him into a living piece of furniture. "We don't just bond with others. We protect what we bond with. Fiercely." Whisktail had fallen asleep against his side, their purring now a gentle rumble that seemed to resonate through the chamber's hull. The sight of the young cub sleeping peacefully against an alien who had been classified as a cosmic threat was apparently having a profound effect on every adult Felinar in the room. "The readings," one of Prowlock's warriors said quietly, "show no deception, no manipulation. The human's emotional output is—" He paused, consulting his own scanner. "It's protective, genuinely protective." "Because that's what parents do," Ethan said simply. "They protect their young. And right now, every instinct I have is telling me that these cubs are under my protection." War Commander Prowlock was quiet for a long moment, his golden eyes studying Ethan with an intensity that suggested he was reevaluating everything he thought he knew about threat assessment and interspecies relations. "In Felinar culture," he said finally, "there is a concept called pack bond. It refers to the emotional connections that bind our communities together, the invisible threads that make us stronger than the sum of our individual parts. Most species," he continued, "can only form pack bonds with their own kind. It's a biological limitation that has shaped the development of every civilization in known space. We assumed it was universal." "But humans," Director Nix whispered, their ethereal form brightening with understanding. "Humans can form pack bonds with anyone." "Which means," Chancellor Gorvith rumbled, his reptilian features managing to convey something approaching excitement, "that humans could potentially serve as emotional bridges between species that have never been able to understand each other." Dr. Frost was frantically taking notes, her scientific mind clearly racing through the implications. The applications for diplomacy, for trade negotiations, for conflict resolution. If humans can instinctively understand and respond to the emotional needs of any species, we could help build connections that have never existed before, Ethan finished. Not through conquest or manipulation, but through genuine understanding and mutual care. War Commander Prowlock stepped forward, his massive form moving with the fluid grace that characterized his species. When he knelt down to Ethan's level, the gesture carried the weight of profound respect. "Ambassador Ethan," he said formally, his voice carrying harmonics that Ethan's translator labeled as deep honor and gratitude. "I must ask your forgiveness. My people have spent generations searching for a species that could help us understand our own emotional limitations. We believed we were alone in our capacity for deep bonding, that no other species could comprehend the connections that bind our communities together." He gestured toward the sleeping cubs, toward the scene of interspecies harmony that would have been considered impossible just hours earlier. "We were wrong. And in our fear of what we didn't understand, we nearly destroyed the very thing we have been seeking." "The Felinar Empire," he continued, his golden eyes meeting Ethan's with steady intensity, "formally requests an alliance with humanity. Not a military alliance, not a trade agreement, but something far more valuable. An emotional alliance. A partnership based on mutual understanding and shared protection of what we both hold dear." "Our young," he said simply, looking at the collection of cubs who had transformed a diplomatic crisis into something resembling a interspecies slumber party, "have already made their choice. They trust you completely. And in Felinar culture, the wisdom of cubs is considered sacred. They see truths that adults have forgotten how to perceive." Minister Pellax's crystalline chiming shifted to frequencies that sounded like celebration. The Quartzian Federation would be honored to participate in such an alliance. Our species has always struggled with emotional expression, but perhaps with human guidance. "The Voidling Collective agrees," Director Nix added, their ethereal form now glowing with what Ethan recognized as profound contentment. We have spent eons observing the universe from a distance, never fully connecting with what we studied. The possibility of learning true emotional engagement. Chancellor Gorveth's reptilian hiss had transformed into something that might have been laughter. The sordid republic has always prided itself on logical decision-making, but logic without emotional understanding is incomplete. We would welcome human insight into the connections we have been missing. Ethan looked around the chamber, at the representatives of civilizations that spanned the galaxy, all of whom were looking at him with expressions of hope and anticipation. The weight of what was being offered and what was being asked of humanity was staggering. "I think," he said carefully, "that this is going to require some discussion with my government, and probably several committees, and definitely a lot of paperwork. But," he added, looking down at Whisktail and the other cubs who had turned him into their personal comfort object, "I think humanity would be honored to help. Because this is what we do. We connect. We care. We protect what we love. And apparently," he said, with a smile that seemed to resonate through the universal translator in ways that transcended language, "we give really good ear scratches." The laughter that filled the chamber needed no translation. It was the sound of understanding, of barriers falling, of connections being formed that would reshape the galaxy in ways that no one could yet imagine. Later, when the formal documents were being prepared and the news of humanity's new role as galactic emotional ambassadors was being transmitted across the stars, Chancellor Gorveth would update the official database entry for humanity. Classification changed from high threat to high value, emotional healers and universal connectors. Special notes: approach with caution, not due to danger, but because prolonged exposure may result in unprecedented levels of emotional attachment and an inexplicable desire to protect this species at all costs. Also, they give excellent ear scratches. And in a small addendum that would become legendary in diplomatic circles. Job description for human ambassadors should include professional ear scratcher as a required skill. Ethan, reading the final report weeks later, while a collection of young Felinar cubs napped around his office, couldn't help but laugh. After all, he'd had worse job descriptions.